This is BSS Sports.
Fires to the end zone. It's caught! It's Greg Lewis! Touchdown!
Brooks with one, lets it fly at the horn. It's gone!
Here's Crosby with a burst of speed up the middle, gets open and scores!
A grand slam for A-Rod.
Pure genius from David Beckham.
And it's in! Thierry Henry with a bullet! Touchdown!
With Thomas Brooks, Steve Schill, and Trevor Struthers. Only on 91X.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are, whoever you are, and whatever time you're listening. This is BSS Sports. My name is Steven Schill, of course, with Trevor Struthers, who spent the entire day calling some football games out in Kingston. And now we're going to talk a little bit about some hockey, and we now know who's going to be playing in the Stanley Cup Final. Trevor, are you happy?
Well, I think it's a nice matchup. I mean, it's similar to what we had last year with Chicago and Tampa Bay. Out of the East, you have a team that's pretty much based on speed, although I do think Pittsburgh's probably a little bit bigger than what Tampa was last year. And then on the other side, you have a San Jose Sharks team that's very physical. Of course, you have to be to come out of that Western Conference. And so you'll have sort of clashing styles in a way, as it's kind of speed against physicality. With that being said, though, like I said, I feel like Pittsburgh can also play that physical game really well, and San Jose doesn't really lack in too much speed either.
The one thing that I kind of find intriguing about this per se is that I feel that the Penguins in general, and correct me if I'm wrong, have almost a bigger fan base. Like when I go around, I feel like a lot of people have Penguins gear, and would you relate that to Sidney Crosby?
For sure, Sidney Crosby would be a huge kind of hook for people in this country. And, I mean, even in Russia, maybe if you were to walk around there, you might find some Evgeny Malkin jerseys around. But yeah, I mean, like, they have some guys that are tremendous hockey players, guys that you can get behind, like a Crosby or a Malkin.
With that being said, though, is, like, I mean, Joe Thornton and Brent Burns. These guys are, okay, Brent Burns is more coming in the spotlight now, but Joe Thornton has always kind of been that rock-solid player. Sure, he hasn't been super flashy or anything, but why is it that Crosby gets all the love? Is it just because he went, higher up in the draft than Joe Thornton, or is it just he's more attractive for the women, so they're into it? I don't see what really the huge difference is apart. I get it. Crosby is a superstar and whatnot, but Joe Thornton, he's a fairly good player as well.
Well, about the whole attractiveness thing, I'm going to say that Joe Thornton, that beard that he's got going on right now, is really driving me crazy. And in a good way, but when it comes down to it, I just think Sidney Crosby is a better hockey player overall. Like, I mean, sure, he went like first overall in the draft, but this is a guy that sort of like Connor McDavid. Although we were probably talked about Connor McDavid more than we did Crosby, he was talked about a lot through junior. He had a chance to play in a Memorial Cup where he got to show his talents for people all across the country. And and so he jumps into the NHL, and he's this phenom. He was given the C at a very young age. Joe Thornton is a very steady player, and he definitely has some skill. This is, I mean, like Sidney Crosby has also played in a couple of Stanley Cup Finals already. This is Joe Thornton's first. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. A lot of it, I think, has to do with Joe Thornton, not really being in the spotlight much compared to Sidney Crosby.
Now, we're going to get back to Crosby and Thornton in a moment, but I want to ask, do you have an out-and-out favorite for the Stanley Cup? Are we supposed to expect anything different? I mean, Leaf fans, I can't tell if they want Phil Kessel to win it or not win it. I mean, James Reimer's on the other team. We have Roman Polak as well. What do you think's going on in Leafs Nation, and what are your thoughts on who's going to win it?
Yeah, the Leafs thing, if you're a Leafs fan, like, who would you root for is a really interesting question. Because, you have Kessel on one side, but you also have a bunch of former Leafs like Spalling, Polak, and Reimer, although he's the backup on the Sharks. So, from that standpoint, it's interesting. Whenever I look at a series, though, the one thing I want to look at is the goaltending. And this one, I really don't know which way to lean. It's really strange. You have two guys that are younger goaltenders that haven't really been in the spotlight, and Matt Murray for the Penguins and Martin Jones for the Sharks. And so you don't really know how they're going to perform and what's going to end up happening. And so I don't know which way to lean there. I think offensively, I'm going to give the advantage to the Penguins, because even if the Sharks are able to shut down Malkin and Crosby in the lines they're on, they have that the Penguins have that HBK line with Hagelin, Bonino, and Kessel, which can also score and has been great for them in this postseason.
And who do you think is going to have a better time in goal? Is it going to be... That's another question, I guess, for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Who's going to play in goal for the final? Is Marc-Andre Fleury going to be like, oh, okay, I'm fine, I'm going to play? Or is it going to be Matt Murray?
Well, you're going to stick with Matt Murray going into the series for sure, and from there, it's all of, based on the performance and what ends up happening. One thing I am kind of on edge about is I will give the advantage defensively to the Sharks and what they have in front of their goaltender, and that's going to help out Martin Jones quite a bit. It was quite the loss for the Penguins when they lost Daly with a broken ankle, I think is what he suffered, and so he's probably done for the playoffs, I think, at this point. And that's a big loss. He's the top 4 defenseman for the Penguins, and that's a tough hole to try to fill in a Stanley Cup final.
Trevor, who do you think is going to be the decider in this series, or do we have any deciders? Going to be Joe Pavelski? Is it going to be Crosby? Is it going to be Phil Kessel? Are we thinking that one team's defense is going to stand on their head? Thinking about a team's goaltender? Who, if they play great, is going to win the series? Or is it so close, matching with skill-wise? What's the takeaway?
I don't think it really comes down to one player, unless maybe a goaltender stands on his head throughout the entire series. I mean, obviously, there's the potential of something like that happening. But other than that, I mean, I look at a complete line. It's not really on defense at all, but I mean, you have some solid lines on the Sharks. But yeah, that HBK line, I think, is really going to be key for the Penguins. And with Crosby and Malkin on other lines, that's going to leave the that line like more available to score, because obviously you're going to put guys like, or I mean, maybe they flip it, where you put your tough guys like Burns and Vlasic on the HBK line, but that's going to leave Crosby or Malkin playing against some weaker defensemen and leaving opportunities there. So I think it's really going to come down to a whole line that's going to have opportunities. Would
you agree with the argument that the Sharks came through a harder path to get to the final, so they're more ready than the Penguins?
You could say that. There's definitely an argument to be made for that, but I think it's difficult at any point in time to get this far into the playoffs, and everybody at this point is pretty worn out. And so I don't think it really comes down, I don't think that has that big of a difference when all is said and done, because both these teams are pretty worn down. And I mean, all these teams here that have made it this far have played pretty long series. I don't think either one, I don't think there are any sweeps for any of these teams to get to where they are. So.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that there's so many of the games so far with the NBA and NHL. And we talked about it last week on the show about, how every series seems to be going to 6 or 7 games. Nobody's being a dominant force in this. And is it a good thing that the league's pretty even, at least in the playoff contenders?
Well, yeah, it makes for some great hockey, or even you mentioned basketball. It makes for some great basketball. It makes for it's a lot. It's really entertaining, obviously, when you have series going 7, even 6 games, and games going to overtime. Although I feel like we haven't seen too many of those. I would like to see a couple of those in the final.
And going back to the Crosby Joe Thornton thing that we talked about, the World Cup of Hockey. Joe Thornton and Sidney Crosby is going to be playing for Team Canada. Team Finland looks kind of like the odd ones out. We're seeing a Team Europe, which is the first time that's happened. Team USA without Kessel. And, as usual, Team Russia is fairly decent. But the thing that I don't get, Trevor's talk to me. Why is it called the World Cup of Hockey? You have the IIHF with all this other thing. You have the Olympics. There just seems to be a constant thing going on with hockey. Why do we need a World Cup of Hockey?
Well, we used to have a World Cup of Hockey, and then it just kind of went away.
It should have stayed away.
Well, the thing with it coming back that's interesting is this is an NHL and NHLPA event. In fact, it's so much so that Russia named Slava Voinov, the former king, to their roster. But he might not actually be able to play because of some sort of legal incident that he was involved in about a year ago. He may end up being banned from the tournament because it's an NHL and NHLPA event. I mean, I don't think he can play in the NHL right now, so that might carry over to that. But yeah, so it's an NHL event, and there are some interesting things. I kind of like the Team Europe because the weaker teams like a Germany won't be in the tournament with weaker players, so it's almost like an all-star team, which should make the games more entertaining that way. The Team North America thing, though, is kind of interesting. You have Austin Matthews, that would otherwise maybe have made the American team, and Connor McDavid, who could have made Team Canada, will actually be playing against those teams potentially in the tournament. So it's kind of iffy that way. It's like, if you're from Canada and you're Connor McDavid, why would you want to beat Canada other than just to win the tournament?
Well, the thing that doesn't really make sense to me, and I'm going to put this in kind of a relation, is like for the CFL, there's only X number of teams, and for this one, there's only, about 10 or less teams for this one. I didn't count, but it seems like a very small tournament. Is there really a point for these small tournaments, or is it just because it's hockey, so not everywhere plays hockey?
Well, I think the reason it's so small is because it's kind of taking place during the preseason. And so, you want to try to get in and out, and you don't want many people getting hurt. So it's kind of just almost a brief little thing, I guess. I mean, I would expect about a round robin of about 4 games maybe, and then you go into elimination mode where there's a few more games added on to that. So overall, you're probably going to have about 8, 9, maybe 10 games in the tournament. So I mean, it's probably just to try to make sure not anybody gets hurt going into the season.
It just feels kind of, I don't know, weak's not the proper term, but in soccer, depending on the teams, especially if you're in Europe, you'll either have the Euro, which is coming up, I believe, next month, a couple days away, actually, and then the World Cup going on every 4 years, and then you have the season going through that, you have the preseason, you have the international tournaments, if you're a bigger team, and then for the NHL, it's just, the Olympics every 4 years, and then the, regular season. But now we're including the World Cup with this. Is this going to take a toll on the players? And, is there really kind of a point to have this? Is it good conditioning? Is it making players kind of, overwork themselves? Or is it good to keep them fine-tuned all year long?
Well, the timing is interesting because it is just before the season, but I'm struggling to figure out when else would you do this. You wouldn't do it during the playoffs. You wouldn't do it in, would you do it in the off season in August? I mean, that's not exactly hockey weather, so to speak. But at that point, you don't have anybody playing anywhere else, and you definitely can't do it at any point in time during the season. So I don't know when otherwise you would do it apart from just before the preseason. So that's probably what happened there.
And finally, Trevor, do you have any teams that you think are going to be facing off in the final or just an outright winner in this tournament?
Well, I don't know how the layout is for all the teams yet, but I'd be interested to see what happens with Team Europe or Team North America even, although I don't think Team North America will necessarily make a run for it. I think their goaltending is a little weaker than the other teams. I'm obviously intrigued a lot by seeing Canada and USA, and hopefully they find a way to meet up.
All right, so that's it for this edition of BSS Sports. Just kind of a little bit talking about the Stanley Cup Finals and the World Cup of Hockey, which is coming up soon. And of course, don't forget Mondays at 2:30 on CJLX 91X in the Quinty area. Tune on in, or you can check us out archiving on YouTube. Videos, audio videos are posted up every single Monday for you to check out. And we will see you on